The price was fixed by the state. A denarius for entry, sometimes two, if the woman was worth it. But the empire decided that too. In Pompeii, in the year 79 AD, just hours before the volcano would bury everything, a woman called Athenais stood in the doorway of the Lupanar, the brothel on the Via dell'Abbondanza, and knew exactly how much of her body the Roman government owned. It wasn't the brothel owner who set the price. It wasn't the men who came with coins in their hands. It was Rome itself, the machine that had systematized human degradation into an economy that had looked at female suffering and seen only profit margins. The Lupanar was famous. Tourists, wealthy Roman tourists, came specifically to visit it, knowing it had 4 stories, narrow rooms stacked like coffins, stone beds with worn grooves that traced the weight of thousands of bodies. But what made the Lupanar famous wasn't the sex, it was the engineering. Rome had taken something that existed in every society, the sale of sexual access, and transformed it into something unprecedented. They had industrialized it, they had legalized it, they had taxed it, they had made it a cornerstone of state revenue and social control. And they had done this with such precision that the system would echo through 2,000 years of Western civilization. The moment a woman entered prostitution in Rome, she entered a machine that had no exit. It wasn't a choice. Very few of the women who worked in Roman brothels had chosen anything. Most were born into it, daughters of enslaved women, or sold by families too poor to feed another mouth, or captured in the wars that Rome waged constantly across its expanding territory. Some were freeborn women whose husbands had died and who had no legal recourse except this. What the empire created wasn't a profession, it was a caste. It was a legal status that marked a woman as fundamentally different from other women, permanently stained, permanently available, permanently property. The system began with registration. Every prostitute in Rome was required to register with the aedile, the city magistrate whose job included managing the infrastructure of vice. This wasn't bureaucratic convenience. This was control architecture. By registering, a woman surrendered her legal name and took a professional name, marking the moment her identity was erased and replaced with a function. She received a tessera, a bronze token that identified her as a meretrix, a prostitute. This token was everything. It was her permission to work. It was her mark of shame. It was the proof that she was government property. Without the tessera, she couldn't legally work. With it, she was marked for life. Even if she somehow escaped, even if she made enough money to buy her freedom from slavery, even if she married and attempted to become respectable, she was always identifiable. The token followed her. Other women could refuse her friendship. Neighbors could refuse her shelter. The law could refuse her protection. She was permanently other. The empire taxed prostitution. This wasn't hidden policy. This was open, systematic extraction of wealth from female suffering. The tax was 4% of earnings. It was called the quadragesima, the 40-part tax, and it went directly to the imperial treasury. When historians calculate Roman state revenue, they don't usually discuss this, but the reality is stark. The empire built part of its infrastructure on money extracted from the bodies of enslaved and desperate women. There were other women who worked the streets outside the formal brothel system, women who solicited in the baths or near the amphitheaters or in the back rooms of wine shops. These women weren't registered. They couldn't be taxed. Therefore, they were hunted. The city magistrates had quotas. They needed those tax revenues, so they arrested unregistered women, forced them to register, forced them into the formal system where they could be monitored and taxed. Registration wasn't protection. It was the opposite. It was the moment the state claimed ownership. The hierarchy within the system was baroque and cruel. At the absolute bottom were the women who worked in places like the Lupanar, the street-level brothels in poor neighborhoods. These women made the least money. They serviced the most clients. They had the least autonomy. The rooms they worked in were tiny. Some, excavated from Pompeii, are barely 8 feet long. Stone beds, worn smooth by constant use. No privacy. Clients could be waited for outside. The woman would be handed over like goods. In some of these establishments, the owner, the leno, would stand in the doorway and call out to passing men, advertising the women inside. There are still graffiti inscriptions preserved from Pompeii written on the exterior walls of these brothels. Oceanus with Martia carved into stone. Felix with Fortunata. These weren't declarations of love. They were advertisements. They were the ancient equivalent of the photos in modern window prostitution, marking which woman was inside and apparently available. The men who came to these bottom-tier establishments were laborers, soldiers, slaves. They had money, but not status. They had sexual need, but no access to respectable women. Above the street-level brothels was a tier of women who worked in larger, more organized establishments that served middle-class clients, merchants, minor government officials, successful tradesmen. These women made more money. They had access to multiple clients per day and could therefore negotiate slightly better terms. Some could eventually save enough to purchase their freedom. This possibility was crucial to the system's logic. It offered just enough hope to prevent complete despair, just enough appearance of mobility to make the system seem not entirely predatory. Occasionally, very occasionally, a woman would accumulate enough wealth to buy out her contract, to purchase her release from slavery if she was enslaved, or to achieve legal independence if she was free-born. The empire allowed this because it served multiple functions. It demonstrated that the system wasn't absolute. It motivated women to work harder, to take more clients, to endure more. It funneled additional wealth from the women who succeeded into the hands of the owners and the state. And crucially, it perpetuated the myth that this was a profession with possibility, not a trap deliberately designed to be inescapable. At the top of the hierarchy were the women who worked in the homes of wealthy men or in exclusive establishments that catered to the aristocracy. These women were often enslaved specifically for this purpose, purchased young, trained extensively, treated as valuable property. They might be housed separately, dressed better, given access to education in music, dancing, conversation, specific sexual techniques. They were not less trapped than the women in the Lupanar. They were simply more expensively caged. Their clients were senators, generals, wealthy landowners. They were expected to perform not just sexual acts, but to be cultured enough to entertain politically powerful men. Their value lay in this combination of sexual availability and minimal intellectual capacity, educated enough to be entertaining, but never so educated that they might develop dangerous ideas about their own autonomy. What the empire discovered was that sex work could be used as a tool of social control that extended far beyond the women immediately involved. By maintaining a visible, accessible, cheap system of prostitution, Rome achieved multiple political objectives simultaneously. First, it provided a socially acceptable outlet for male sexual aggression and need. Men who had access to enslaved or dependent women at home would still visit prostitutes for reasons of class distinction. They didn't want to soil their own women with their more extreme desires. The prostitutes bore that burden. Second, the system created a permanent underclass that could be pointed at and blamed for social problems. Prostitutes were blamed for moral decay, for disease, for corrupting young men. They became the scapegoats for every social ill. By maintaining visible prostitution and then condemning it, the state achieved moral authority while simultaneously profiting from the system it condemned. Third, the system extracted enormous wealth. Conservative estimates suggest that in a city like Rome, prostitution generated revenues that rivaled or exceeded major industries. The state taxed not just the women, but also the brothel owners, the landlords who rented space for brothels, the men who supplied them with food and wine and oil and perfume. The mechanisms of control went deeper than economics. There was the question of disease. Roman prostitutes were required to undergo medical inspections. The empire understood venereal disease. They didn't have the medical terminology we use now, but they recognized that certain infections spread through sexual contact, and they recognized that this was a public health crisis in a city where sexuality was commercialized at this scale. The inspections were brutal. Women were examined internally to check for signs of disease. This wasn't medical treatment. This was surveillance disguised as health policy. The examinations served as additional mechanisms of humiliation and control. They reinforced the message that a prostitute's body was not her own, but rather public property, that the state had the right to inspect, evaluate, and reject if it failed to meet standards. Some women were found to have infections and were forced to continue working regardless because the state needed the revenue. Others were simply banned from working, cast out with no means of survival, expected to die quietly somewhere outside the city walls. There was also the question of movement and visibility. Prostitutes in Rome were legally forbidden from wearing certain clothing. They couldn't wear the stola, the formal dress of respectable Roman women. They couldn't wear certain colors that marked higher social status. Instead, they were required to wear specific clothing that marked their status immediately, clothing that was deliberately gaudy, deliberately visible, designed to make them immediately identifiable as prostitutes. The empire did this deliberately. It needed prostitutes to be visible. This visibility served a function. It reminded all women of the consequences of stepping outside proper roles. It reminded men of their power. It made clear the hierarchy of female status. It also made prostitutes easier to control and monitor. A woman in prostitute clothing couldn't blend into the general population. She couldn't escape unnoticed. She was constantly marked, constantly visible, constantly subject to state surveillance. There were regulations about where prostitutes could operate. In many Roman cities, prostitutes were forbidden from certain neighborhoods, the wealthy districts where respectable citizens lived. They were geographically confined to specific areas, often near the city gates or in lower-class neighborhoods near the port or the barracks. This segregation served multiple purposes. It kept prostitution visible to those who wanted it, but invisible to those who wanted to pretend it didn't exist. It made the women easier to tax. It prevented any possibility of the women integrating into respectable society. And crucially, it meant that if there was ever need for a crackdown, if the state decided to demonstrate moral authority or to punish the lower classes, the prostitutes could be easily found and imprisoned. They were geographically trapped as completely as they were legally trapped. The strangest aspect of the system was something that emerged in the later empire, particularly in the waning centuries. As Christianity began to influence Roman law, there was a movement to regulate and formalize prostitution even further. Instead of random taxation and occasional raids, there emerged something closer to organized brothel systems run by the state itself. These weren't exactly state brothels in the sense that the government directly employed women, but they were brothels that operated under direct state contract and supervision. The women who worked in these establishments were often criminals or social undesirables, women who had committed crimes, or women who had no family, or women who had been deemed morally unsuitable for other employment. They were assigned to the brothel system and told to work, with most of their earnings going to the state. It was slavery formalized into administrative structure. It was the empire saying, "We will take this system that has always existed semi-criminally in the shadows, and we will bring it into the light, legalize it, systematize it, and make it obvious that this is how we, as a state, treat women who fall below the line of respectability." The psychological mechanism underlying all of this was something the Romans understood intuitively, even if they didn't have psychological terminology. By maintaining a visible, accessible system of prostitution and then condemning it, Rome achieved something crucial. It allowed all other women to be complicit in the system. Respectable women looked at prostitutes and understood viscerally what would happen to them if they stepped out of line. The prostitutes were not separate from respectable society. They were the warning. They were the consequence made visible. Every prostitute marked the boundary of acceptable female behavior. Every prostitute reinforced the message that women belonged in one of two categories: respectable women who were property of their husbands and fathers, or disreputable women who were property of the state and available to any man who paid. There was no third category. There was no space for female autonomy. The system was complete. What makes the Roman prostitution system significant isn't that prostitution existed. It existed in most ancient societies. What's significant is that Rome took something that could have remained semi-informal and semi-sanctioned, and instead engineered it into a total system of control. They recognized that by legalizing something, by making it official, by taxing it, by regulating it, they could extract maximum value while maintaining maximum control. They understood that visibility was more controlling than secrecy. They understood that making women identifiable, marking them, confining them geographically, limiting their access to other economic opportunities, all of this was more effective than direct violence. Oh, there was violence too. There was always violence as background threat. But the system didn't primarily function through violence. It functioned through economics and law and architecture. The women who worked in Roman brothels left almost no record of their own experience. What we know comes from graffiti they scratched into walls, from the casual references in the writings of wealthy men, from the archaeological evidence of the physical spaces where they worked. In Pompeii, we have names: Oceanus, Felix, Fortunata. We have graffiti scratched into the stone. Rufus was here. Marcus loves this place. We have the wear patterns on the stone beds that show where thousands of bodies rested. We have the narrow doorways that could be closed and locked. We have the evidence of the system. But we don't have the women's voices. They are gone. The empire made sure that they would be forgotten. By marking them with legal status, by making them officially prostitutes, by segregating them and taxing them and regulating them, the empire erased them. They were so completely defined by their function that nothing else about them remained. They were not women. They were functions. They were revenue sources. They were warnings to all other women about what happened when you fell outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This system didn't die with Rome. It echoed forward. Every subsequent empire that wanted to manage sexuality would look at Rome's model and recognize its efficiency. The structure, legalization, taxation, regulation, geographic segregation, legal status marking, medical inspection. This structure would reappear again and again across centuries. It still exists in forms we don't always recognize. The Roman prostitution system was the blueprint for how states could claim control over female sexuality while appearing to be merely regulating a pre-existing phenomenon. The Romans didn't invent prostitution, but they perfected the machinery for converting female suffering into state revenue and social control. And that machinery, that logic, that system of thinking about women as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected, that's what survived Rome. That's what echoes still. The women of the Lupanar are dust now, scattered by the volcano, lost to history. But the system they inhabited, the system that marked them and confined them and extracted their wealth and erased their identities, that system is still with us. It has just learned to hide better. It has learned to call itself by different names. It has learned to make women complicit in their own disappearance. And that might be the most Roman thing about it.